Hello there. The next thing we're going to look at is how the air actually gets in, or the process of inspiration. Now, before we get started, just to let you know, we're going to look at a video of a cadaver. So in case you're a little squeamish, close your eyes for a bit. So this is the Institute of Human Anatomy, and this is a cadaver of a human. I want you to pay attention to this large muscle at the bottom called the diaphragm. Here are your lungs, and here is your heart with the pericardium around it. I'm just going to let him describe the thoracic cavity for a bit, and then you can also see your ribs here, and then we will talk a little bit more about the breathing process.
So what you're taking a look at here is a thoracic cavity. We've removed the chest wall and even the abdominal wall down lower. And yes, we've got some cool little lungs here and here. Now the right lung actually has 3 lobes, and if you see, there's the division right there between the superior and the middle lobes. That's 1 and 2. And then if I reflect those away, you can see the 3rd lobe back here, and that's the inferior lobe here. The left lung only has 2 lobes. We've got the superior lobe here. And if I kind of move this big old heart out of the way, you can probably catch a glimpse of that inferior lobe there. And you can thank this big old heart for crowding out that potential 3rd lobe of the left lung. So let's talk about this whole idea of what we need to happen for air to be exchanged with the lungs and eventually get into the bloodstream. For oxygen exchange to occur, and for breathing to occur for that matter, we have to increase the volume of this thoracic cavity. And we're going to do it 2 ways. We're going to increase it vertically by pulling things down, and we're going to increase it by increasing the width, essentially, by bringing the ribs out and up. Now, if that happens, we can get more air into this cavity. One thing you have to really pay attention to here that's kind of important to note, these lungs on the cadaver are deflated. That would be bad if that were inside you. Obviously, this is a cadaver, but I want to bring up this key point here. Inside of you, there should be no space between the actual lung and the inside of the thoracic wall here. Now, on the inside of the thoracic wall, there's this thin membrane called the parietal pleura. Parietal just means wall, pleura just means lung. If you come to the zoomed in view here, you can see me pinching that thin membrane right along here. Now, that membrane is continuous onto the actual lung tissue. And the membrane on the lung tissue, even though it is continuous with the parietal pleura, we changed the name to visceral pleura. Visceral just means organ, because it makes sense, it's on the actual organ of the lung. So again, to really illustrate this point, inside of you, that visceral pleura would be essentially touching the parietal pleura here, and on that zoomed in view, you could see essentially the lung tissue here, which would be the visceral pleura on top of the lung tissue, would be touching that parietal pleura, that serous membrane there, with a little bit of fluid in between. So that fluid's super cool for 2 reasons. One, that fluid allows some nice loosey-goosey sliding and gliding between the 2 membranes to reduce friction between the actual lung and the thoracic wall. And it does something else that's really cool. Have you ever put 2 pieces of glass together, like with a little bit of water in between, and stuck them together? And I say stuck them together because when you put 2 pieces of glass together with a little water in between, it kind of sticks them together because of the increased surface tension. But it still allows them to slide and glide. That happens inside your thoracic cavity. Essentially, that fluid between the lung here and the wall here reduces the friction, but keeps the lung adherent to the wall as the chest wall expands during deep breathing and even regular breathing. So one of the things that I found really helpful when learning about the mechanics of breathing was breaking it down into kind of these 2 separate phases of breathing in versus breathing out, or inspiration, inhalation, expiration, exhalation. So let's start with the muscles that are involved in inspiration, or in other words, breathing in. And we're going to start with the diaphragm. And if you take a look at the cadaver dissection, you can see the diaphragm here. Now, one thing to note about the diaphragm is it is a divider. Essentially, it divides the thoracic cavity above.
Okay, so that's enough to give you an idea of what muscles we're looking at. The muscles that are very important in breathing are the diaphragm, and then you can kind of see the ribs here, and in between the ribs is something called the intercostal muscles. And those are the ones we're going to look at when we talk about breathing. So when we look at the process of inhalation, there are two groups of muscles used. As I explained, there is the intercostals, and soon you'll realize that rib is costal. So intercostal just means between ribs. And then the second one is the diaphragm. I know, too many too many letters in the word diaphragm. So many I can't even spell it correctly. Diaphragm. Forgot the R. Sorry. The diaphragm. The diaphragm is that lower muscle. Now, when you think of the diaphragm contracting, don't think of it as a muscle flexing and getting bigger. Think of it as when you go to pull saran wrap over a bowl. So when you pull it tight, it flattens down. So the lower muscle will flatten when contracted. And the intercostal muscles move up and up. Sorry. And because of this movement, there is an increase in the volume of the lungs. First off, a volume of the chest cavity. Then he showed you those pleural, the parietal pleura and the visceral pleura. Now, the parietal pleura will stick to the wall. The visceral pleura sticks to the, parietal pleura, and the lungs stick to the visceral pleura. So, as a result, the lungs are stuck to the wall of the chest cavity. And as the increase in the chest cavity happens, when you're breathing in, your chest goes up and out, that will increase the volume of the chest, increasing the volume of the lungs. Now, because the lungs, all those, the air molecules that aren't in there, that are moving around, now have they now have more volume to move around. This results in a decrease in lung pressure. And as a result, air moves from high pressure to low pressure, so air will move in. Okay? It's more of a sucked in than it is a blown in. So air will move in to follow the pressure gradient into the lungs. Let's get detailed here. To follow the pressure gradient. Okay, and that's how your lungs inflate. Now, how they deflate is, we're not sure why I don't have the process of deflation. So that's inhalation. When we look at expiration, expiration is called a passive process. And in the passive process of expiration, the muscles can relax. And when the muscles relax, the lungs recoil and push the air out. Okay? Now, that is normal relaxation or rested relaxation. Let's say normal. But you can also have forced. So if you're going, notice that when you're going, you're kind of crunching your stomach muscles together. So in forced expiration, muscles of the abdomen, so it's the, we can use those muscles, you know what they are, the rectus abdominal, and rectus abdominal and other chest muscles help to squeeze the chest pushing air out. Okay, so there are two different muscles, two different coordination of muscles. The first one in normal expiration, which is you're just sitting there breathing, your diaphragm relaxes, your intercostal ribs, so your intercostal muscles between your ribs relax, and air is forced out. Good. Oh, here it is here. Describe the muscles caused in relaxation. I put it too far ahead. Let's just fix that. Good. Now, that is breathing. So we'll look at the conscious control, the unconscious control of breathing. We look at the unconscious control of breathing. First off, conscious control of breathing is when you go and you think about it. And of course, if I told you to breathe normally, you'd think about it and you would change your breathing rate. Now, there is the control centers in your pons and medulla. If you remember, your spinal cord's up, the first bump's your medulla, the second one's your pons. There are breathing centers in your pons and your medulla, and these will interpret the information coming from the receptors and usually will increase breathing. Now, when we talk about receptors, there are two different types. Well, they're chemoreceptors is what they are. So here's the word to spell chemoreceptors. And chemoreceptors will result from a change in a chemical or an increase in a chemical. And surprisingly, it's not oxygen. It has to do with carbon dioxide. And when carbon dioxide reacts to water, it produces carbonic acid. And carbonic acid will then change the pH of your blood. So the oxygen levels or the change in pH are detected by the receptors in the pons and the medulla. And they will then send a message to the diaphragm and to the intercostal muscles to increase your breathing rate. And when you increase the breathing rate, you'll get rid of more carbon dioxide, which will lower the pH. Also, receptors that aren't shown in this diagram, oxygen receptors. And the oxygen receptors are in the top of your aorta and the blood vessel that goes to your brain, which is really handy because those are the vessels that need the best oxygen. And they will detect oxygen levels dropping. And if they do, they will send a message. So if we go and look at our diagram here, our note sheet, the location of the receptors is pons and medulla. The trigger is a decrease in pH. And notice it's a little p capital H when the amount of carbon dioxide increases. Okay? And the effect is to send messages to the pons and medulla. To send messages. The pons and medulla, let's get that again. The pons and medulla send messages to the diaphragm and intercostal muscles to increase breathing rate. That's not good. I haven't spelled diaphragm right yet. Let's try that again. Diaphragm. Okay, diaphragm. Good. And that will increase the breathing rate. Now, we still have to talk about gas exchange, but I'll do that in another video. So that's enough for this one.